What does it take to become very good at something? Whether it's learning a language, learning an instrument, playing a sport, or playing a video game, are there common threads of behavior that separate the very best from everyone else? Yes, I've experienced this myself, training a variety of quite disparate disciplines, and Josh Waitzkin, in his book The Art of Learning, mentions coming to the same realization after he transitioned from being a world-class chess player to a world-class martial artist, and realizing, although these two disciplines seem so completely different, there were common patterns that separated the very best from everyone else. For example, he noticed that those who express themselves through what they're doing are always able to outperform those whose inner personalities are oppressed by their relationship with that activity. So, what are the most commonly overlooked yet most crucial ideas to bear in mind in order to become the very best you can? Here is my answer: the ingredients for mastery. So the first and most important point, in my opinion, is that in order to ever hope to achieve a very high level of skill in something, you need to find a way to derive joy from the most fundamental and even mundane aspects of this skill. You can't expect something to get fun once you get good at it, once you're doing the cool, fancy, advanced stuff. If you hate doing something at the very beginning, how can you possibly expect forcing yourself through a couple thousand hours of this activity to make you feel? Now, maybe there's a chance your feelings will change, but that's very unreliable. So people who get very good at something, they don't get there sheerly through the power of self-discipline alone. They get there on the back of self-discipline and willpower that's fueled by a deeply rooted mental connection with this activity. On some very fundamental level, they simply enjoy doing it. So let's perform a little thought experiment about a girl named Amy who wants to learn Chinese. And for any of you learning Chinese or some other foreign language, this may be not entirely a theoretical thought experiment. So, Amy wants to learn Chinese, and she has this vision in her mind that's motivating her. The vision is, wouldn't it be cool if I could just walk into some Chinese restaurant, and when they ask me in English, what do you want to order? I could just reply in perfectly cool, smooth Chinese, no need to speak English. Here's my order. I want this, this, and that. Just blow everyone away with my perfect Mandarin. Well, she has this vision, and that's great. That motivates her to start learning Chinese. But let's think how her language learning journey is going to go. First couple months, I'm sure they'll go great. But 3 months in, 6 months in, the realities of the difficulties of actually learning another language are going to start to pile up. And the relatively flimsy or superficial motivation that this vision in her mind is giving her is going to start to prove to be a little too weak to really overcome the difficulties that are facing her. And so she either needs to replace this motivation with something more powerful and more fundamental, or she's unfortunately going to end up just having to give up. So, initially, we probably have some superficial motivation for stepping into a new realm, into a new activity. If I think of pretty much anything that I've ever done in my life, the first venture into that has always been fueled by either a superficial motivation, completely random chance, or even someone else forcing me to do it. But very quickly, I found that I needed to form a connection in my own mind with this activity and a reason for myself to keep doing it. Otherwise, I was going to very quickly just fail. So, your goal as a beginner should not be to optimize that first month of training routine. And I don't care how optimization-minded of a person you are, because I'm a very optimization-minded person. The efficiency of your training in the first month, in the long term, is not going to matter. To get very good at something, you need to spend years doing it. A slight change in efficiency at the very beginning is going to have almost no impact whatsoever. But if during that time as a beginner, you look at this activity with an open mind and you explore it, and you look to have as much fun as you possibly can. That should be your objective. Have as much fun as you possibly can. Find all the ways that this activity can bring you joy. Then, that will help foster the proper relationship psychologically between you and this new activity, And then that will be able to motivate you for the months and years to come as you continue to dedicate yourself to this activity. So, what was my initial motivation for learning Chinese? Well, for me, it was simply the sounds of the language. First of all, I found the idea of a tonal language just so fascinating. I remember thinking this idea that you could say the exact same sound, but just say it with a different tone of voice, and it would be a completely different word. Just so cool. And of course, now to me, I know what that feels like, but I remember thinking at that time, that's a cool idea, and I want to experience that firsthand for myself. And then I also know that the unusual consonant sounds the Chinese language has just fascinated me so much, and still do. For example, some of the sounds like qi, ji, xi that we just don't experience in any other language that I'm familiar with. These really fascinated me, so combining the tonality with just the unique sounds themselves created this fundamental element of the language that I really enjoyed. And for me, just hearing the language brought me joy. So that means anytime I watched a TV show, or talked to someone, or talked to myself, or read out loud, or pretty much engage with the language in any way at all, my mind was given this positive reinforcement. My mind was telling me, hey, I like doing this. And so, I don't mean to make this sound overly glamorous. Like, am I enjoying every second of studying Chinese? Do I wake up every day and just jump out of bed ready to study Chinese? No, of course not. There are times when I feel frustrated. There are times when I feel overwhelmed, or it's too difficult, or even that I want to quit. But the crucial point is that the foil to these frustrations, the counteracting force to these feelings that it's too hard, or that I want to quit, or it's not worth it, are not some flimsy, superficial vision in my head, but a deeply rooted element of my psyche that says, I enjoy doing this thing. Number 2, time alone does not create a master. Mindless practice does not make perfect, or even necessarily progress. The metric of importance here is not time, but quality time. So maybe that sounds simultaneously obvious and completely useless. What is quality time? My definition of quality time is as follows. The total amount of quality time you spend doing something is the total amount of time, but for every unit of time, say for every hour, you multiply it by your mental presence factor during that hour. So, for example, suppose someone studies Chinese for 2 hours every day, and suppose that they're focused, mentally present for 1 second, and then they have 4 seconds of their mind kind of wandering off on its own thing, and then they snap back to it for another 1 second, and continue in this way. Now, that may seem pretty terrible, but I think if you actually think about it in reality, for anyone who hasn't trained themselves to be very focused, this is probably pretty normal. We spend most of our time with our mind just wandering on its own train of thought, and occasionally we snap back to reality. So this person has spent 2 hours or 120 minutes studying, and their mental presence is 20%. So that yields 24 minutes of quality time. Now you can see when we do the math like this, the numbers come out much lower than we're used to. But that shouldn't be seen as a negative or a depressing thing. In fact, that's really fantastic news. It shows us how much space there is available for improvement. Suppose that you don't have much time to study per day, and you're worried that you're going to kind of lose by default to these other people who have hours every day to study. If you study every day and all you have is 30 minutes, but you bring a very high level of mental focus, you're mentally present 80% of the time during that practice or during that training. That means that you're going to get the same amount of quality time out of that half an hour as the other person got out of their 2 hours. Of course, the formula isn't quite perfect. So at the very extremes of the skill level spectrum, very beginners and very advanced practitioners of the discipline, it starts to break down. For the very beginner, you'll see that there are often basic conditioning exercises that need to be done. For example, for someone new to martial arts, they might need to do some hand conditioning exercises. And this doesn't really require a very high level of mental presence to be effective. And on the other side of the spectrum, for the advanced practitioners, you have the complete opposite effect, which is that any time spent where they're not very highly focused is almost completely wasted or sometimes even detrimental. So the formula isn't perfect, but the lesson it teaches us is still the right one. Be mentally present during your practice sessions or during your training sessions. Be completely focused, and the results will be remarkable. On the topic of time, number 3 is a rule I call Sean's rule because I first heard it from my friend Sean, vocalized succinctly as follows. Learn X in Y time is always nonsense. Now I remember I first came across this phrasing several years ago in an advertisement that I heard, learn Chinese in 2 years. And what's crazy is that now, when I think about that sentence, it doesn't even sound that crazy in my mind. But if you think about it, it really should. To learn Chinese, a completely unique and different language in 2 years, even if you're dedicating 100% of your life to learning it, even if you're fully immersed in the language, that's still almost impossible unless you're also a language learning genius. But that was only the beginning. Then after that, it started to become quite popular on YouTube, and I started to see videos, learn Chinese in 1 year, learn Chinese in 6 months, learn Chinese in 3 months, 2 months, learn Chinese in 1 month. And also various people writing articles and blogs online, learn Chinese in 2 weeks, learn Chinese in a week. I even saw learn Chinese in 10 hours. How crazy is that? So obviously, it sounds ridiculous because it is ridiculous. But the question is, how did we get there? So, from my analysis, the fundamental problem with the learn X and Y time structure is that the thought process that created it was a backwards one. Rather than the creator saying, hey, I would like to teach X, and I'm going to go out and research all the different things that you have to learn X, and then compile them into a nice structure, and therefore teach people X. I'm going to go about it the backwards way and say, you know what, it would be super cool if I could say, you can learn X in Y time, or Y is faster than anyone's ever seen before. So I'm going to go search online and see, how long does it take for people to, say, learn Chinese? And see, oh, there's some videos, learn Chinese in 3 months, learn Chinese in 2 months. Okay, I want to grab people's attention. So I'm going to make a video called Learn Chinese in 1 month. And then they do all the research, and no matter how good it is, they're going to have to compress it all down into this thing, this Learn Chinese in 1 month. And the problem is, at the end of this process, the definition of what it means to learn Chinese or learn X, whatever the X may be, has been abandoned or mangled so completely that it's not really learning X anymore. And especially if you consider this process being iteratively repeated time and time again, in the end what you get is these titles that are so ridiculous that they're either intentionally or accidentally just complete falsities. So you may think I'm being a little bit harsh, because learn X, after all, is a very vague phrase, and perhaps the person who wrote it just had a different interpretation of what it means to learn X than I do. And I tried to keep this mentality for as long as I could, but the real nail in the coffin for me was a video that YouTube started recommending me some months ago entitled, Learn the Splits in 1 month. And unfortunately for the author of this video, learn the splits is a phrase that has a pretty strict minimum criteria for its completion, and that is that your legs must be able to make a straight line. And also, unfortunately for the author of this video, the thumbnail was him supposedly showing off him doing the splits, in which his legs were clearly not in a straight line. So we can see that the structure learn X and Y time has really bent the definition of learn X past its reasonable malleability. However, the real question is, does that mean that all this learn X and Y time is really useless? And the answer is no. Somewhat to my dismay, I've learned quite a lot from this type of content. And so my advice here is, whenever you enter the territory of learn X and Y time, you bring a very scrupulous mind, and you bring in your mind your own definition of what it means to learn X. And so as you're watching, you pull out the valuable pieces of information that the creator is presenting you, but you also persistently ask the question, in what way is the creator cheating the definition of learn X in order to squeeze it into this too short of a time frame? And so then when you go back to integrate what you've learned into your own training schedule, you can adhere to your own definition of learn X while also gaining the valuable information that you did. So the deeper lesson here is to, one, be scrupulous of anything that seems too good to be true, and to, secondly, stay true to your own goals and your own objectives, your own definition of what it really means to learn this thing. Because if you had 100 different people and their goal is all learn Chinese, but you ask them concretely define what it means for each of them, you'll come across 100 different instantiations of what learn Chinese really means. So, be careful comparing yourself to other people. It's very easy to see the ways in which they surpass you. They learned this quicker than I did. Right? They can do this that I can't do. But you miss the things that they sacrificed in order to get that. So, learn what you can, but remember to stay true to your own goals and your own objectives in terms of learning the language or the skill that you're learning, because that's what's going to keep you motivated and bring you happiness. Number 4, on the path to mastery, there are no shortcuts. However, there are optimizations. So what's the difference between a shortcut and an optimization? Well, a shortcut is the cutting out of the learning of something, while an optimization is the replanning of the learning of that thing to be more efficient while still learning that thing. So to make this more concrete, let's consider a thought experiment in which Emily and her friends plan to start learning Chinese together. However, Emily comes to the realization that the Chinese writing system is very complicated and will take a lot of time to learn, but her personal goals are not to read advanced Chinese literature or to write essays, but simply to be able to communicate with Chinese people in their native language. So she decides she's going to study only oral Chinese and not waste time learning the written language. So what's going to happen as this scenario unfolds? Well, initially Emily is going to seem to be studying at a rate much more quickly than her friends. For the first couple weeks, for the first couple months, she's going to make far more progress than they have made. But then over time, over maybe 6 months or a year, her friends are going to start to catch up. And what's happening is that in Chinese, the vast number of homophones require some sort of writing system to fall back on to distinguish the fact that there are a dozen commonly used characters, all pronounced exactly the same, shi, but all written completely differently. It means that Emily's friends are going to have that advantage, that they're not going to be confused by this and can breeze right through those sentences, while as Emily is going to start to get inundated and very confused with this aspect of the language. So soon, while Emily started out ahead, her friends will actually leave her in the dust. And what did this teach us? Well, the writing system is a fundamental facet of the Chinese language, and even if you don't plan to use it at all in any direct way, you still need a firm grasp of it in order to wield the language effectively. You can't shortcut it. So, if you can't shortcut it, can you optimize the learning of it? And when I think about this, I like to think back on my vocabulary quizzes in middle school. Because at first, I would review for these vocabulary quizzes by simply having a list of all the words, covering each definition in succession, and just trying to recall the definition in my mind, one by one. And then soon I realized there's always like 1 or 2 pesky words that I can't remember the definition of, but the rest of them, it seems like a complete waste of time to even review. So I would draw little stars by those 2 words, or you could also write them on separate note cards. and then review those starred words or those words on the note card separately several times. And once you felt confident with them, then you could go back and review the whole list one last time. So this is a great optimization. But there's so much more room for improvement even beyond this, right? Why should I only have 2 categories of difficulty? Why shouldn't I have like 5? Or why should I even have discrete categories of difficulty? Why not a continuous spectrum of difficulty on which I could rate every single word? And that difficulty then would influence the amount of time that I wait before reviewing that word the next time, tracked separately for each word. And furthermore, for each word, every time I review it, I should be able to update that difficulty, which would then influence the time until the next time I see it. Well, this seems kind of complicated, but in software it actually already exists. It's called SRS, or Spaced Repetition Software. For Chinese character learning, there's an app that's very popular called Skritter that I would highly recommend if you want to learn Chinese writing. And if you're planning on learning any language or anything that involves a large scale of memorization of information, I would highly recommend at least taking a look at SRS, because the efficiency benefits that it provides over simple linear memorization of items is astronomical. It almost feels like magic the first time you use it. So, optimizations can sometimes feel like shortcuts because the benefits they provide are so substantial. How do we make sure we distinguish between optimizations and shortcuts accurately? Well, ask what time is being cut out. Is it time spent learning some fundamental skill? In that case, it's a shortcut. Or is it time spent perhaps reviewing something that you already know or doing something that's not having a specific effect? In that case, it's an optimization. In practice, it can be a little bit vague and difficult to try to distinguish between the two. So I'd like to end with the most common manifestation of a shortcut error. A beginner enters into a new field, and after practicing the fundamental skills, the basics, for a few days, they quickly want to advance on to the more advanced techniques. Because they rationalize, the more advanced techniques involve all the basic skills, and so they can learn the basics at the same time as learning the advanced skills in a more efficient way. It does make a lot of sense, but unfortunately this is a path to devastating failure, as we will talk about more in the next point. Number 5 will be posed in the form of a question. Think of someone that has spent a lot of time doing something, but still just seems to suck at it. What happened? What went wrong? Well, I can think of a fair number of people that I've met throughout my life that satisfy these criteria, and there's one common answer in all cases. They did not learn the fundamentals. Maybe they didn't want to learn them. Maybe they were never taught them. Maybe they thought, like in our previous example, that they could learn the fundamentals in parallel with the more advanced skills. Or maybe they just thought it wasn't fun to practice them, so they didn't. Regardless, they don't have that fundamental skill base, and so now they've reached a wall that their weak fundamentals cannot get them past. So when you're trying to motivate yourself to learn the fundamentals, which are often seen as boring or not fun, consider the following scenario. You want to get good at this thing. If you want to get good at this thing, that means you're going to spend years doing it. Let's just say, for the sake of this example, you're going to spend 5 years doing this thing. If at the beginning of that time, you spend a couple months learning good, solid fundamentals, then for the next 5 years, every day you spend practicing, every hour you spend engaged in this activity, you're going to be reinforcing and strengthening those good fundamentals. But if instead at the beginning of that time you neglect those fundamentals, now every day you spend practicing, every hour you spend engaged in that activity, you're going to be reinforcing and strengthening the grip those bad fundamentals have on your mind. And after 5 years, you will have essentially given yourself 5 years of anti-training, cementing the wrong ways of doing things into your mind. What this means is that, in all honesty, after 5 years of training the wrong way of doing things, the probability that you could ever achieve mastery in your life in this discipline is vanishingly close to 0. The way that I specifically motivate myself is by watching someone who's incredibly good at something, but watch them do something very simple. So I remember one of the first times I went skiing. I was on the very easy slope, and I'd been practicing there a little bit, starting to feel pretty confident. Maybe I should move on to the next slope. When I saw, down the very slope that I had just come, a group of competitive or maybe even professional skiers came snaking so gracefully down the mountain that I felt to call what they were doing skiing and what I was doing skiing, while technically correct, was not even justifiable. We were doing completely different things. The grace, the elegance, and the power with which they moved was nothing like the way that I had moved down the mountain. And so, in that moment, I learned that this mountain, this very simple slope, could serve as my practice ground for months or years to come, and I still wouldn't be able to move the way that those people had moved on this very slope. That was very inspiring for me. In other fields, you could think of the way that a professional rock climber places every foot so carefully on each foothold, even if they're so strong that they could climb up with their hands alone. Or listen to the quality of the sound that an opera singer makes, singing just a single note. Or watch the way that a professional ballerina can make the simple act of even walking appear. And if you're learning a language, listen to the way that a native speaker of that language says a very simple phrase, like, "What time is it?" Right? The confidence, the beauty with which they utter that phrase. It's really inspiring. Paying attention to these things, it can be a very transformative experience because it shows you how much you have to learn in the most simple and mundane aspects of any skill. So let this be your inspiration. Masters of their craft exhibit beauty in what they do, not through the practice of advanced and fancy techniques, but because everything they do, down to the most simple and mundane of actions, are imbued with the grace and precision of decades of rehearsal.